Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us today. Okay, coffee.
Pinky out.
Matcha and some tea. I'm liking the diversity and the tea here. So once again, everybody, my name is Angelica Erazo, and I'm a part of Oracle's diversity and inclusion team. I'm a proud member of the LGBTQ community and identify as a Latina, lesbian, she, her pronouns. I want to thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you find this information helpful. Today, I will be your moderator, and we will hear from Tilden Chima and Isaac Ortega Hernandez during our panel and Q&A session. Tilden is an associate cloud engineer based out of Santa Monica and goes by he, his pronouns. Isaac Ortega Hernandez is a business development consultant based out of Boston, Texas, and goes by he, his pronouns. I want to give a special shout out to Cheryl Lander, who is our National LGBTQ chair, who is in the background, making sure all of our tech stuff is getting worked out. And thank you, Marilu, as well, for helping us out. It really takes a village to come together today. And I hope that all of you are drinking water, drinking your tea, and being able to take care of yourselves during this pandemic, during these really eccentric times. If you haven't already, I encourage you to get a cup of tea to join us for our tea chat shortly. Today's talk is going to be around intersecting gender and race, aka the term intersectionality, and what that means for queer communities of color. I want to start off by going through a short abstract example of understanding intersectionality. But for the first slide, what I want to do is I want you all to drop in the chat or in the Passable one word or phrase that comes to mind when you think of the word intersectionality. And we're gonna have Tilden read out some of these responses.
Commonalities from Lara. Layers of identity, I think that's a good one. All right, we don't all fit into one box from Nicole. Multiplicity by Jorge. Forgotten, oh, that's deep. By Amanda, love that. Beautiful, Jennifer. Layers. Privilege and Awareness by Jesus. Southsider. These are all wonderful, guys. Like, I probably couldn't even come up with better like words and phrases that so resonate. Unintentional connections. Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of explanation to third parties. I think that's something that we could all relate with. And yeah, there are really so many good examples here. Common groups, crossroads, so many that I probably compounded challenges, bringing your whole self, uniqueness. Angelica, I think we have so many great examples that we could go off of. Over to you.
Yeah, so thank you for participating. And we're gonna run through another similar exercise. What we call a fun guide. This was created by Marianne Dobson to explain intersectionality in an abstract example about Bob the Triangle's experiences. So this is Bob. Bob is a stripy blue triangle and should be proud of his identity. Sadly, some people do not like Bob. Bob faces scrutiny for being a triangle and for having stripes. So here we can see Bob being a little sad. And then you have somebody protesting Bob, down with the stripes. God hates triangles. Now Bob is a really sad striped triangle. Luckily, there are liberation groups, but they aren't necessarily intersectional. So they look like this, right? Welcome triangles, where they're accepting Bob for being a triangle. And then there's another group where it welcomes Bob for being a stripe. So he's having to kind of navigate, where do I belong? And they don't exactly talk to each other. They actually compete with each other. The triangle says, I'm more oppressed than you. The stripes will say, no, I deserve more, right? More resources, more attention. And Bob now has nowhere to go. Am I more of a stripe or a triangle? So poor Bob is just really having some identity issues. So what I want to do is I'm gonna have Tilden run this exercise here about the QT poll prompt. Should Bob go to the triangles? Should Bob go to the stripes or to the circles? Because they're the cooler group anyways. So passing it off to you, Tilden.
Okay, absolutely. I am taking a look at the poll. So guys, go to the Pathable system. There should be a poll that says Bob should go. And just drop your responses. Right now we're at 50%, well, 0% for the triangles. That's actually quite a surprise, but 33% to the stripes, 67, 88 to the circles. Everybody agrees that they're cool. They're the cooler group. So, well, okay. Some love for the triangles now. 12% to the triangles, 29%. Okay, 14% to the triangles, 25 for the stripes, 61 to the circles. So Angelica, it really looks like the majority here are like, you know what, let's just forget about the triangles, forget about the stripes, and just join the circles because they're the cool kids. So hopefully we could explore a lot more about that throughout the course of this presentation. Over to you, Angelica.
Thank you. So, it's a sad reality that Bob really doesn't have a place to go. The triangle group could try to meet his needs, right? Bob Stripe's identity. They should be more embracing that he is a triangle, and then the stripes too. But what we see a lot in these spaces is that there's, as people of color, a part of the LGBTQ community, they don't have places to go because you'll have the identity liberation groups where sometimes they experience homophobia, and then you have the LGBTQ group. Sometimes there's racism within the group that queer people of color experience. So what we could see from Bob's experience is that really he's isolated here. And I really like this exercise because it's an abstract example of poor Bob, the stripy triangle, just trying to move through the world. So I'm gonna move on to the next slide here. So now to explain intersectionality, right, what is it? Intersectionality is a term created in 1989 by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw to describe how race, class, gender, and other individual characteristics intersect with one another and overlap. Crenshaw describes it like this: intersectionality is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. It's not simply that there's a race problem here, a race gender problem here, and a class or LGBTQ problem there. Many times that framework erases what happens to people who are subject to all of these things. In other words, intersectionality is about power and how intersecting forms of power impact our lives. This term was specifically created to explain the unique experiences of intersecting oppression that Black women experience. Now we use intersectionality to talk about how many different groups of people, but it's important to remember that the root was to specifically talk about Black women, and now that it's expanded. Intersectionality does not just mean having different identities or an organization thinking about different identities. It's specifically speaking to the layered experiences of oppression. For example, being an LGBTQ person of color. Oftentimes, it's easier to believe and to explain to others that all women feel a certain way or all LGBTQ people believe some common understanding. But this really doesn't reflect reality. We must recognize that all unique experiences of identity, and particularly ones that involve multiple overlapping oppressions, are valid. So do not shy away from recognizing that people experience the world differently based on their overlapping identity markers. And I'm going to share some of those examples. Because of the way that we have all been socialized to continue feeding systems of oppression, we often feel like it's rude, to formally recognize each other's differences. We see this in how people are uncomfortable naming another person's perceived race or asking for people's preferred pronouns at times in non-LGBTQ spaces. However, we must recognize that these identities as a way to step beyond our assumptions and to experience, and that our experiences is common. And to that note, becoming comfortable recognizing differences also involves recognizing and that difference is not represented in the spaces you occupy, right? Diversity of kinds matter in your workplace, your activism, community spaces, and more. So if you're meeting with an LGBTQ organization, is there representation for queer people of color? You may feel like the workplace is racially and ethnically diverse, but is it accessible to people with disabilities? You know, take note of the welcoming or distancing practices, spaces you frequent. So on to the next slide. I wanted to talk about experiences of African-American queer people. You know, for example, you'll have a gay man has to deal with homophobia, and then a Black gay man has to deal with racism. So now and a Black gay man will have to deal with homophobia and racism often at the same time. And to take it a step further, it is often the case that he will face racism within the LGBTQ community and homophobia in the Black community. In some communities of color, it is said that queerness is a white thing and weakens the community. This can be a very painful thing for queer people of color, and we know that historically this is not the case. Communities of color, indigenous communities of color from around the world, from India to Latin America to Africa, have historically embraced and even celebrated queerness and gender diversity. These practices were targeted by the violence of colonization for what we see. For example, during slavery, and huge trigger warning here because this is very intense information. Well, we won't get too much into it, but during slavery, slave masters would often sexually assault their male slaves to gain dominance. This can help us understand some of the historical contexts and trauma our communities of color face. Sometimes homophobia can be a result of trauma, right? But please remember right now, I'm talking about homophobia in communities of color specifically because we're centering queer people of color, but it is not the case that communities of color are more homophobic than non-POC communities. It's a very harmful myth that we sometimes hear. And the intersection of race creates additional barriers like access to healthcare, medication, or proximity to higher infection rates. African Americans make up more than 40% of all people living with HIV in the United States, despite African Americans comprising only 12% of the US population. That's a huge disparity. We often hear about references made around the world with the difficult relationship around church and homosexuality. We can read literature, early literature from James Baldwin, Go Tell It on the Mountain, right? Where he makes a reference to the difficult relationship he has with homosexuality and spirituality and explores a role of conflicting intersectionality identities. We also understand the role that conversion therapy plays and how we see religion being used as a weapon to discriminate around LGBTQ people and QPOC communities. For example, me, I came out when I was 15, and the first thing my family did was take me to conversion therapy, and that was really traumatic. Even though I came from a family that's historically oppressed in how the United States treats undocumented people, my own family had biases around the LGBTQ community, specifically around religion. And we can see this a lot within our communities. And we see these numbers making stark differences when it comes to African Americans, Asian, and Latinx individuals in conversion therapy. And I want to give a shout out to the Trevor Project, who's really doing a lot of groundbreaking work around conversion therapy, but remembering that these intersectionalities heighten the type of discrimination that these communities experience. And I want to share a report with you all. It's one of the most founding reports that I found about LGBTQ people living in rural America. This image here came from the report where we call home LGBTQ people of color in rural America. You know, people of color, including those in rural areas, are more likely than white people to identify as LGBTQ. People of color comprise 42% of the national LGBTQ population, compared to 36% of the US population. And LGBTQ people of color generally live in the same rural areas as other people of color do. For example, the US South is home to 9 in 10 Black people, and Black same-sex couples are also concentrated in the South. LGBTQ people of color in rural states are especially vulnerable to discrimination. Or overall, rural states are significantly less likely than major urban states to have non-discrimination protections, and are also more likely to have harmful discriminatory laws. States with worse LGBTQ policy climates also have higher populations of people of color, meaning LGBTQ people of color especially are at risk of discrimination and especially lack the proper protection against it. LGBTQ people of color experience similar or higher rates of both poverty and unemployment compared to non-LGBTQ people of color and white people, right? If you watch Pose, right? Pose is one of my favorite, shows to watch because it really highlights the stark reality of what communities of color, part of the LGBTQ community experience, specifically Black transgender women. And I will say I saw the category is yes, I love that. And it's just a really good education show that highlights these disparities that we see, whether it's in the city or rural America. And smaller populations in rural communities mean any difference is more noticeable, right? If you're visibly, right, like me, I'm a butch Latina woman, I'm more likely to experience increased visibility in rural America. And for LGBTQ people of color in rural communities, increased visibility may also mean further vulnerability, right? They're vulnerable, they're exposed. And while LGBTQ people in rural areas face discrimination, they may have fewer alternatives for culturally competent providers and fewer opportunities to find a job. This is especially true when businesses and service providers are given a license to discriminate. This is something that our community knows too often. For example, many senior care providers and hospitals in rural areas are religiously affiliated. Increased religious exception laws may also allow such providers to discriminate even when providing taxpayer-funded services. So your tax dollars at work are not working for you, right? You're seeing tax dollars where you're being taxed and they're not working for you and the resources that you need. So I'm gonna move on to the next slide here, but this is such a great report, a very rich report that I recommend that you all look into. And moving on to the next slide. For Latinos, much of the similar experiences that Black queer people experience, we see the Latinos community also experience. There's similarities, but there's also differences. From the slide, we can see that Latinos are 1.7 times more likely to experience police violence than non-Hispanics, and 1.5 times more likely to experience discrimination and hate violence in the workplace. I can tell you that personally, I've been harassed by cops over 14 times in my life, really, at gunpoint, without having a criminal record, only for a simple traffic violation or playing soccer in the street where it was legal. In addition, LGBTQ Latino immigrants face unique challenges due to being both ethnic minority, sexual minority, and undocumented. Meanwhile, Latino and Latina, transgender, and gender nonconforming people face some of the highest levels of discrimination of all transgender people, according to a new analysis released by NULAC this past summer. Additionally, the findings reveal that immigration status also plays a role in these outcomes, with a non-citizen Latino respondents often reporting even worse experiences. Remember that Latina women in the US are paid 46% less than white men and 31% less than white women. Workplace discrimination for queer Latina women can be compounded, and it's a sad reality. And to also add, queer Asians are seeing an increase of discrimination and violence due to COVID, right? So we know that the Asian community right now is being targeted, but we're seeing a stark difference in queer Asians also seeing heightened attacks against them. One member of the National Queer Asian Pacific Islander Alliance was hit with a shopping cart in a grocery store, while a board chair was threatened by a man who came to her home with a machete. A machete. Others, meanwhile, said they had been harassed on the street by passengers screaming at them, "You brought this here," or witnessed fellow riders on the bus switch seats because after they sat down. And this is just so sad that this is the reality that a lot of queer Asians are facing right now. And Asian Pacific Islander, transgender people often live in extreme poverty, with 18% reporting a household income of less than $10,000 a year. This is higher than the rate for transgender people of all races, which is 15%, 6 times the general Asian population, 3%, and over 4 times the general US population, which is 4%. I collected this data from the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force. From this study, we also see that 21% of Asian transgender and non-conforming people reported having been refused a home or apartment due to bias. In addition of identity, when you add identity layers, it adds oppression to queer people of color and their experiences. Moving on to the next slide. And one common experience that LGBTQ people of color also experience is erasure, right? For example, the Stonewall riots should be considered an important part of the Black history. Leaders like Marsha P. Johnson, Stormy Delbari, Miss Major, and other several Black transgender and queer people were on the front line for those 6 nights in the summer of 1969. And yet the 2015 movie Stonewall downplayed the role of Black queer people played in leading the riots, going so far as having a white gay man throw the first brick, instead of Marsha P. Johnson, and highlighting their contributions to the movement. So we see this erasure happening too often within our communities. We see it all the time with the national gay agenda, not really calling attention to the issues that queer people of color are seeing around housing, being kicked out, access to healthcare. The national agenda has mostly been focused on marriage equality, but not really talking about these issues where we see queer people of color falling through the cracks. After understanding this, stark reality, we created a white paper for some resources on understanding how to be a better ally to queer people of color. So feel free to look into that. And the main thing here is do not expect, people who face different systems of oppression than you to rally for causes you care about if you do not rally for theirs. It goes back and forth, right? We want to make sure that, we always see Black transgender women with every civil rights movement we've seen in this country. They've been the backbone, always making sure that they're there. But when it comes to providing resources for them, the community doesn't show up. So we want to make sure that we're, keeping that in mind. And as you hear about issues others face, learn about the work that is currently being done around these topics. Listen and defer to those who live in these intersectional identities each day. As you do, you will likely deepen your understanding of your own identity and subjects you care about most. Take a deep look into your employee resource group and ask yourself, as a leader and a member, what am I doing to make sure queer people of color are represented in my organization, and I'm providing them support. purchase and read books written by queer people of color to further understand intersectionality within the LGBTQ community. And don't engage in erasure of contributions made by queer people of color, right? Speaking up if you see erasure or an opportunity to highlight a queer person of color, bringing that into existence, using your ability to make sure that you're providing visibility to others. Now, with all that in mind, I know that was a lot. I want to move on to the highlight of our event, which is our amazing panels. You've got to hear a little bit from Tilden, want you to hear a little bit from Isaac. Tilden and Isaac, thank you, once again for joining us. I want to share that some logistics for the panel is if that you see something that resonates with you, that you hear from Tilden and Isaac, please drop sipping my tea in the chat. We're going to start off with having Tilden and Isaac provide a short introduction about themselves. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen here. All right, Tilden and Isaac, please introduce yourself.
Yes, so my name is Isaac Ortega Hernandez, and I'm a business development consultant at Oracle. I've been in my role for about a year, and I'm currently located in Austin, Texas. It's the beautiful city. I love this city so much. I won't go in too much detail about my story just yet because that's something I want to share with you all as we move forward. But that is my introduction, so I'll pass it along to Tilden.
Thanks, Isaac. Really appreciate that. And first of all, let me just start by saying, Angelica, you are an amazing person. I can't, every time we hop on a panel together or we do something together, I just continuously discover more and more about you. Mm-hmm. And for me, honestly, some of the experiences you shared so far, being able, I'm not someone who always feels necessarily always comfortable with sharing my personal stuff because, you don't want to be reflected on as vulnerable or weak or, you're trying to be the victim. And, as I've shared before, it's continuously exhausting to sort of have to validate your experiences. But I just want to let you know that you speaking up and continuously speaking out and being a voice has given me permission to always share my light as well and speak up as well. So I really do appreciate you for that. Now, with that said, I really want to say a big hi to all turn 17, turn 18 of our panel, our attendees here today. My name is Tilden Chima. I'm a solutions engineer at Oracle, focused on our integration team. So I help with building apps and app integration, fun stuff. And in terms of my gay job, what I do is I am involved in our open LGBTQ community. So over the past 2 years, I've led our Santa Monica chapter. And over the past year and a half, I have co-led our North America, all of our North American membership. And so today, I really just hope that it's an opportunity to kind of get to share experiences, share stories, and learn from each other about intersectionality, especially when it comes to the topic of race.
Yeah, thank you for that, Tilden and Isaac. So let's get into it. Let's start off with, what are some experiences that impact you by being both a person of color and a member of the LGBTQ community? So talking about your intersectionality here. And we're going to start off with Isaac.
Sure, thank you. So this is where my story comes into play. I was born in Mexico, Guadalajara, Jalisco. I was there for quite some years, but I moved to the United States when I was in first grade as an immigrant. So I moved to the United States with my family. I spoke no English whatsoever, so that was definitely a barrier that I had to overcome. I would say, as the years progressed, being an immigrant family, we came from a very low socioeconomic background where my family had to find opportunity where they could get it from, right? So I think when I came out to my parents when I was very young, their reaction was very negative because I felt that the discrimination that they were facing was very internalized and they feared that me being gay, especially a gay immigrant, you know, a lot of opportunities would close. And I think that was their main fear for me. They were scared that, I would not have the opportunity to succeed in this country. They felt that, you know, I would face a lot of discrimination. And the sad reality is that, this is something that when I think about, I do think that, they made some points. We as a gay man, there's a lot of challenges that I have to overcome. But, I think at the end of the day, being authentic to yourself and respecting your own identity, you can overcome any challenges that are presented to you. And so I think that's where my story comes into play, and the intersectionality of me being LGBT as well as being an immigrant comes into play. And there have been a lot of challenges that I've had to overcome, but I wouldn't want to be anybody else but myself.
Absolutely. And, I just to echo some of the stuff, Isaac already said, I feel from my perspective, I feel, being a Black gay man, son of immigrants, and just, I feel for me, it's having, an indelible sense of pride, an indelible sense of, happiness, fulfillment with, all the different parts of my heritage that, I bring to the table. I'm excited about my Black culture. I'm excited to, watch, I have, my mannerisms and all of what comes with that. It's feeling an indelible sense of pride all the time. But at the same time, it's also, it definitely is also feeling, especially with the context of what's all going on, because I think, I can't really detach from that, you watch like the Black Lives Matter movement, you see it all on media and you see it on screen. It's also feeling, I don't know, like sometimes just, just weird, and what does the world think about me? I have, like, does the world really fully accept me for who I am? It's a question that often comes sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And I keep on using this experience because, it's an experience that I think, it just completely always, every time I think about my intersectionality and just sort of recognizing that, and, that first feeling was, when I was in college and I hopped onto Grindr for the first time, and here I was, after high school, being excited for all this while, and, I'm finally ready to explore and try to see who's out there, get my gay on. And I remember like coming across a profile and I see someone saying "girl, not grinder." But it's so true, because I feel like, it's part of a lot of our experiences. And I remember hopping on for the first time, and like it was like no chocolate, no spice, no curry, no rice. And I was like, huh, that's weird. Like, what is that? Like, all these terms, I'm so used to it. Like, what does this mean? And I was like, this guy's really specific about the food items that he wants to eat. And so, like most people, I do a Google and Urban Dictionary to just try to find out what that's about. And what I saw, it didn't really necessarily make me feel too good about being on the app. So I remember like for like my whole sophomore year, I just like turned it off. And I refused to come back for, a whole, it was longer before I decided to hop on back again. And Grindr has made some awesome changes over the years. So I've got to give them kudos for that. But, I keep on bringing that because again, like I say, it is feeling an indelible sense of pride, excitement, happiness, fulfillment. But at the same time, from time to time, just having to question whether people really, accept you for your full self. And, I think this is something that I'm still exploring. It's still something that I'm answering because I'm discovering more about myself, every day. And, as the world also grows and moves on, people's perceptions are also changing. So that's pretty much it.
Yeah. I mean, I would like to just add to something that Tilden added. When I was in college, right after graduating college, and I was navigating the workforce, I told myself, like, where do I belong as a gay man, right? I think when we watch shows, you always see the gay man as like working in fashion, working, just like you think of your role as a very limited window, right? And you know, I remember I'd asked this panelist once. I was like, what would happen if I bring my authentic self to work and they don't accept me? And she told me, and this is something that has really like stuck with me. She said, if they don't want you there, don't work for them, because like, you need to be yourself 100%. And if you're working for a place that does not accept you, you do not need to, like, you know be there. And there is a place for you. And I do think that, you know as a salesperson, I always had a fear of, especially the way that I have to talk on the phone with customers. My biggest fear was they're gonna hear my gay ass voice and they're gonna be like, "Girl, bye," right? I cannot hide it. This is just something, like, my voice is super gay, and that was definitely a subconscious fear of, how are people going to perceive me, and it's still something I think about, and it's something that I'm trying to overcome. So, you know, moving the floor.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think both of you touched on this a little bit. But if you could go a little bit further, what do you want people to understand about your experiences, as a queer person of color? And Isaac, I'd like to hear from you.
Yeah, so what I would like, so somebody put in the chat here, how do you ensure intersectionality doesn't lose an intersectionality focus and turns into discussion about who is more oppressed, right? So I think when you think about intersectionality, I think it's all just about sharing our experiences and understanding ourselves a little bit more. How everyone's doing snaps because they resonate with us. I think it's important for us to think about our experiences as a learning methodology, right? We are learning from each other on how we navigated the world, how we navigate our lives, and how we ourselves can become better, and how we can make the world better for us. Um, and I think also something that I would like to share is, and this sort of pertains more into, the gay sphere, is our gayness to me is a culture, right? Our gayness has its own life, has its own color, and the way sometimes people narrow it down to just sexuality, to me is very, does not do it justice, right? We are a community that share um, similar likings. We have our own speech in some sort of way. What is it called? Like slang. We have our own slang, right? And I do think that, it's important to embrace those things, and it's important to resonate with one another in order to understand ourselves and understand the world better.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Hmm.
Thank you, Isaac.
Yeah, of
Tilden, your
course.
opinion?
Speak on it, Isaac. So honestly, this is the thing, and I know this might sound cliche, but I really feel it kind of boils down and comes to it. I think when you interact with people, and you get to, from board meetings to the workplace, even graduating college, and running student organizations. I think it boils down to understanding that most people really want the same basic thing, and that is to feel seen and to be understood, period. In the Black community, I don't want to have to constantly validate, my being gay, being a homosexual. I don't want to have to do that. In the gay community, I don't need to I don't want to have to constantly validate, oh, systemic racism exists, and starting having to, have that conversation there as well. And so I think ultimately, for myself, and I think for a lot of people, it's just, it's being able to really understand that people come from a wide variety of experiences. People have lived different truths, and sometimes we all need to just keep an open mind and continuously learn. I say this, and I'm not trying to say this from a moral high ground, because I've also been quite open as to, even being a gay man in the community, part of the LGBTQ community, I had to learn on the topic of, what the trans community is facing, because for the longest time, I didn't really understand all of that. So I think it really just comes to being able to keep an open mind, being able to just try to see people, understand people, listen to their experiences without necessarily judging them for it. And I think the other thing I also want to add to that is also not making their experiences all about you, because I've seen that happen so many times, too many times, too many often, and it's something that it frustrates me. It's when you think about people talking about Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. That's literally what it boils down to. You try to spotlight or you talk about an issue, and then another group is like, oh, but wait, what about us, and what about this and that, and try to waylay the issue. So I think that's really what it boils down to, what it really comes to. People want to be seen, people want to be heard, people want to be understood, and we really just need to be kinder to one another, especially here in the United States, as this election season is coming. But I'll speak more on that later.
Yeah. And we just kind of went over through Pride right now. So Pride, 2020 occurred in the midst of a global movement around racial injustice and Black Lives Matter. How do you think these events impact the conversation around celebration of Pride, if at all? We'll start with you, Isaac.
Yeah, so I think there has been a drastic shift in the way we see movements. Somebody posted on the chat, it was Jesus. Someone said, how do you navigate through age as a factor in intersectionality? Well, I would like to say, through the ages, different age groups have experienced Pride differently, right? I think, for example, I have gay friends who are older than me who say to me, I admire that you're so open, because when I was your age, I didn't have the representation that you have now in order to embrace yourself, right? And I think we're coming to this age in our world, in our country, where we're seeing, intersectionality come into play, and we're seeing other voices come in, and I think that is a drastic change, because now not only are we witnessing Pride in a very, oh my gosh, in a very like white, heteronormative, masculine way. We're now including trans people, we're now including people of color, and now those people of color, those trans individuals, are seeing themselves being represented in movements, and that is huge. That is a huge cultural shift that I think is only going to get better as years progress, and I'm really excited to witness this, and witness how younger generations are, going to respond to this. So that is my take. Tilden?
I'm giving you my take. I'm just responding to what Jorge said in the chat that I thought was really awesome. Because we had a similar event like that too in LA. So I'm glad that New York City did something as well. But just to answer the question, and it also kind of ties into what what I was just chatting about with in the chat, is I really feel, if you ask me, is that Pride has never been bigger than it has in the previous years than this year. because, in LA, for example, and talking about really what I saw in the streets, and first of all, let me bring it back to what Angelica kind of shared in the beginning of our panel, right, with Marsha P. Johnson and, the Stonewall riots. The Stonewall riots were riots, like they were a protest. They were because, folks were like, listen, we're not going to take this brutality anymore. We're not going to allow you to continuously, hurt our communities. We're going to take up space, and you're going to listen to us because we are not going anywhere. And for me, seeing what the sort of conversation that's been happening in our country over the last few months, especially during, this past Pride Month, I just couldn't really feel much prouder. I'm much more excited about our communities. I think quite frankly that, in the gay community, what I've seen, prior years to this is that I've often felt that, sometimes pride becomes, has often been like commodified and packaged and, tried to message to the mainstream. It's like a Coachella concert. It's like you're going for a Coachella and, everybody's like, and don't get me wrong, like I love all of that. I love a party. I love a kiki, sign me up for, a party with a drag queen, RuPaul's Drag Race. But at the same time I think oftentimes the message gets lost because, you ask a little girl about pride and you say, okay, what's all of this about? And, she could tell you love, but like, the conversation doesn't really go so much more than that. And I think that's something that we just all need to keep in mind is, we need to really keep in mind what pride is ultimately all about. It's about solidarity. It's about belonging. It's about creating spaces where all feel included. And, even as we celebrate Pride, post-COVID, let's always make sure that these messages are kept at the forefront. So that's really, my take on Pride. I think, Pride TM might have, been canceled this year, but Pride was definitely in full effect. So, yeah.
Yeah, when I think about like your comments till then, like when it came to Pride this year, I felt very conflicted because I said, look, I'm so happy that I've gotten to a place where I can publicly hold hands, right? I think we've all experienced this, where you're walking down the street with your partner, you're holding hands, and then sometimes you let go because you're afraid of your safety, whatever the case is, right? And I think about that where now I'm in a safer place where I'm able to do that. Austin, Texas, pretty easy city to do that. There's not as much discrimination. But when I went through the virtual Pride parades, seeing everything that's happening, the drive-in drag shows, I was thinking it's hard for me to celebrate when I see what's happening to, the Black community right now around police brutality. And I want to see more of my people, the LGBTQ community showing up, right? Because, Black Lives Matters are always making statements to support all sorts of communities, but sometimes we see that lack of support. So it's around centering this marginalized community within a marginalized community that's oftentimes erased. So that's why I really appreciate your comments, Tilden and Isaac, because they're so true, right? Of what we're seeing around Black Lives Matter, the Pride parades, right? A lot of erasure of issues that people are experiencing. And I want to go into, just because we're out and equal, I want to talk about the workplace. How are you currently navigating the workforce as a person of color and a member of the LGBTQ community? And I'm gonna have you start off, Isaac. I really like, the story that you shared about embracing yourself and wearing heels, right, on your first week, and just really saying, I'm gonna be who I am and I'm gonna wear heels and I'm just gonna rock it. So I just want to hear more from you on
that. Well, it all boils down to the conversation I had before. So when I was in college, I was watching a panelist talk about career, right? And one of my burning questions was like, okay, how do I navigate the workforce as a gay person? So I am he, him, but sometimes I do alternate between they, them, because I am, fluctuated. My identity fluctuates in times. And so, she told me if they don't want you there, they don't want you there. find a place that fits you. So taking that into consideration, right? We were doing, Oracle was hosting um, a session where we were able to see the the office, and they were explaining to us a little bit about the role. And so I decided that I was going to show up the first day I walk into Oracle fully looking like myself. So I put on my heels, my oversized suit, my black eyeshadow, and and my little clip-on earrings. And I was walking with my little bag, right? I'm literally walking there with my little bag, clutching my pearls, because I was like, oh my gosh, like what is going to happen? Like if I get rejected, do I belong here? Because if you guys have not seen the Oracle office, it's gorgeous. And it's like, I was like, do I belong here, right? So I showed up, and to my shock, it was received very well. And I was just like, oh my God, like I need to, like, this place is accepting me, so like I need to work here, right? Like the advice that was given to me of belonging, was resonated with me. But it's also important to recognize, when I'm talking about belonging, it is important to recognize that there are, okay, this is going to sound like super, this is a T. There are places that are not going to accept you, right? But it is always your responsibility as an LGBTQ member to claim your space, right? Even if they don't want you there, girl, get your bag and claim it, go for the opportunity. And I think again, it's all about finding the opportunity, as a LGBTQ member. There's going to be challenges that you're going to face, but it is your responsibility. You own it to yourself, nobody else, to climb that ladder and to make that money, provide for yourself, and build the life that you want. And it's so funny because prior to this presentation, I think something that was very heartfelt is, um, again, you guys, I told you all that when I first was coming into sales, I felt very afraid of how I was going to be perceived, in terms of, because when I think of sales, I think of like the corporate man in his suit, closing deals, like super aggressive. And I did not necessarily feel like I channeled that. But my manager pulled me aside and he told me, you know, I understand that you might not necessarily see the representation, that that you want, quote unquote, um, because I mean, there's not a lot of LGBTQ people or trans people in sales roles. Um, and so, but he told me, you do belong here. You do deserve to be in first place. You do deserve to be in a leadership position. You do deserve this. And I think all of us deserve that. And I think that should be your number one priority when navigating the workforce, really internalizing that you do belong here, you deserve it, and like Britney Spears said, you better work B. Okay,
Yes.
that's all
Yes,
I gotta
my
say.
Jack.
Period. Period.
I am dying. Oh my God.
But yeah,
There's
cheers,
definitely
girlies.
cheers. I mean, let's see, Isaac sort of said it all, but just to kind of add, just a little bit to that. I think, again, it really boils down to what Isaac said. It really boils down to authenticity. Oh my God, why am I messing that up? Authenticity. For me, I spent whole period of my younger years trying to hide and trying to someone asked me, oh, do you like, are you gay, do you like, try to avoid the question by all costs. And the truth about it is it becomes exhausting. At a point you can keep on running, but for how long are you going to run? It becomes exhausting to to continuously run away from your truth. And so for me, you know, at this stage in my life, I have just told myself that I have no, like, I am not going to do anything else than be my authentic self. And you know, it's in terms of doing that, like I've always it really takes a village. It really takes a community. And I've always been someone who, like, I'm not afraid to reach out and ask people and try to find and, you know, make communities for myself. Because the truth about it is, I don't really need a huge group of people. I really just need, you know, a few of my close friends who, you know, I could always, you know, I can always reach out to, and, you know, I can connect. It's really just those few people that, you know, you can always count on. And so, like, at work, in terms of the workplace, some of the things that I've done was, you know, I got involved in an ERG. I met so many awesome people, Isaac, Angelica included. You know, in Santa Monica too, locally where, you know, I work, we have a thriving community there. And even outside the workplace too, in terms of my professional life, like I'm part of NESB, I'm part of Out in Tech, and I'm active in those communities as well. We've done, you know, events with them. And I think this is the thing too, like speaking about the intersectionality of those groups, like I know like with Out in Tech, we have a queer, trans, like Black, Indigenous, people of color community within the larger group, so that we actually facilitate these conversations about, you know, our intersectionality. And same with NESB. I know we recently did about a couple of months back, a panel for LGBTQ members in the Black community and talking about that. So I think, you know, I think within, you know, different organizations out there today, like the conversation and the importance of intersectionality is definitely coming to the forefront, although there is still so much more work to be done. And for me, it's just, you know, tapping into these communities and, you know, even sometimes when I feel like the conversation, you know, hasn't been started, you know, I'm never someone who's afraid to like spark a conversation. And, you know, like Isaac said, like, you know, own that space, claim your space, and, you know, be willing to, you know, speak your mind and speak your truth.
Yeah, yeah. And I want to go into like this conversation around allyship, right? What's the importance of solidarity between movements and a group of people? And also, if you could talk a little bit about what are some examples of everyday ways people can practice solidarity to you, to show you this is allyship, this is how I like to be cared for. And we'll start off with you, Tilden.
Ooh, okay, you caught me there again. So I think, sorry, could you repeat the question again? I think you were asking about the importance of solidarity, but I just
go into the importance of solidarity, like between movements, and then also what are some examples of everyday ways people can practice solidarity?
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's an excellent and awesome question. And what is the importance of solidarity? So I'm gonna use this example because I think it's an awesome, you know, an awesome example. But first of all, to start off, shout out to the notorious and the one and only notorious RBG, because, you know, she left a legacy, and I think it's going to be a legacy that, you know, even from years on now, we're going to still, it's going to still be very important and relevant to us as a country, and to the legal justice system. And the reason why I highlight that is because, you know, recently, as many of you know, there was a bill that that passed that basically, you know, essentially said that you couldn't really discriminate against people based on, at the Supreme Court, based on, you know, their gender expression, you know, their sexuality in the workplace. And sort of reading through, because, you know, it's something that I do, sort of reading through the precedents for that bill, it was really kind of, it was, you know, amazing and interesting to realize that the precedents for that was actually, you know, the bill that, you know, RBG successfully argued in front of the Supreme Court in 1969, I believe it was, but don't quote me on that. Really, you know, on the basis of sex, you know, also kind of, you know, arguing that that women and, you know, men should have equal rights. And so the reason why I bring that up as a solid example is because I've always said this. I feel like success for any one of our groups ultimately is going to translate to success for all. And that's why, you know, as a Black person, you know, it's never going to be up to Black people to, like, you know, stop racism, or the gays to stop homophobia. or, disabled people to stop ableism. And so, we need to always be ready and willing to stand up for each other and speak out on it and call out, the issues. Because, when we're able to fight for one group, then, and successfully win as well, like it ultimately, you never know it, but like it's always going to ultimately translate, later on down the line. And then with that said, so the second part of your question, which is in regards to, ways as to, practicing more solidarity. So first of all, there is an awesome white paper that Angelica put together, that's in the Pathable Files channel. So I urge folks to explore that. But I'll kind of boil it down to 2 or 3 main things that I think ultimately is really what it comes to when we talk about solidarity in the workplace. Now, the first thing I think is it's always important for all of us to be able to acknowledge our privilege and our positions of power. And so one of the things that we always have to do when we walk into a room is to then, sort of question your surroundings and be like, ask yourself, whose voice isn't being represented in this room, or who should be included in this room that is not present here. And then, make the effort to include them in that room. Now, when you do so, the next thing that I would also say, or the second main point really, is about signal amplification and being able to raise one another's voices. And that's, as simple as like, you have a meeting, there are a couple of you in the meeting, Lisa raises a point, but then, somehow it gets passed over, you could raise up your hand and be like, oh, hey, I think Lisa just made an excellent point. Could we get back to that? And, what that really does is it credits the original author of the idea. And then it also lets them know that they have an ally in the room. So for me, that's really what it just kind of boils down to. It comes down to, acknowledging your privilege, questioning your surroundings, amplifying the signals of one another, especially when you are in a position of power in a setting, and there might be someone who doesn't have as much power or privilege as you do. And one other thing that I also want to kind of add to this, and I know I'm kind of going on a tangent here, but I think that's really what the context of this conversation is about. It's really about creating tools for supporting one another. I think it's important to realize when we talk about sponsorship, right, that it's not just about necessarily always like giving budgets or financially, or like when we talk about executive sponsors in the context of ERG, that's what we always think about. But it's really about breaking glass ceilings for one another. It's being somebody doesn't have access to an opportunity and being like, oh, hey, I think that this person, recommending for them for a role, or writing a good message to their manager and being like, oh, do you know how awesome this person was at X? And I think, again, like, it's not something that you should do in silence. It's something that you should always feel free to do publicly, and do that for one another. So that's really what it comes down to when I think about solidarity and solidarity in the workplace. But over to you now, Isaac.
I think you covered a lot, and I think all I have to add is just it's really important for us to, when you amplify one voice, you amplify everyone's voice, and I think that's super important to do. But I think Tilden, I think you touched all the points, and this is your strong suit. So spill the facts.
Thanks.
Yeah, excellent. So we don't have any additional questions. So I want to see if there's any closing remarks from Tilden and Isaac before we transition into a small presentation that Isaac's going to talk about, different techniques that you can use to, confidence builders within the workplace. So are there any closing remarks before we transition over?
Angelica, are we doing Q&A now, or is that like afterwards?
After the
Okay.
Isaac's presentation.
Awesome. I don't really have any closing remarks, but I will just say, you can find me on LinkedIn at Tilden Chima. You can find me on Instagram at Tilden Chima. I'm always someone who's willing to talk and, have these conversations, especially now that I realize that we're at such a precious and very important time of our country's history. So, I just really feel that, we really should be having all these conversations with each other, within our families, because, you never really know, you know, like when we think, I mean, like just thinking about like the last election, right? It's like we had Hillary Clinton win the popular vote and still lose, and it's just, and it's amazing, you know, how that happened. So, but it really boils down to the fact that it ultimately boils down to the fact that it's just a little people, you know, a little number of people who ultimately decide, you know, where our country goes, you know, towards to, you know, and so for me, I just really feel that it's really important that we have these conversations. So I'm always willing to, you know, talk, share, listen as well, and, you know, just learn from one another.
Excellent. Thank you, Tilden and Isaac, for your remarks. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so Isaac can highlight some coping resilience enduring strategies and coping mechanics at work. So let me go ahead and share it here, and feel free to take it, Isaac.
Yes, thank you so much, Angelica, for giving me the opportunity to just share some strategies that I've used in my personal life to empower and become resilient as I navigate the workforce. And to me, I would like to start off by saying that these strategies are they're going to sound very spiritually, I guess, because I think at the end of the day, when you're navigating life, I think a lot of the resilience comes from an internal mindset. So the first strategy is acceptance and resistance of stereotypes, right? So acceptance for me has been a long, challenging journey, as I assume is for a lot of us. Um, but I think starting to think about accepting your identities and sitting down and reflecting on who am I, what does Isaac want, what can Isaac accomplish is super important, especially when navigating a world that, you know, might not be as friendly towards you as you would like it to be. You know, and I think this can definitely foster a sense of self-esteem, competence, as well as a sense of belonging. And I think we talked a lot about belonging, especially as it relates to intersectionality. Like, do I belong in the triangles? Do I belong in the circles? Right? And I think it's just about sitting down, reflecting, and telling yourself what areas of, you know, my identity, quote unquote, hinder me versus which ones empower me. And I think you really need to yeah, I think you just need to reject the stereotypes that come with some identities, and don't let those expectations of that identity hold you back. Because like I've mentioned before, you know, at the end of the day, your life is in your own hands. And I think you being able to become resilient and being able to overcome challenges at the end of the day is going to benefit you. And then the second point, something that Tilden talked about as well, is being connected with support of others. So building a network, right? I've built a network internally at Oracle with allies as well as individuals that reflect my identity, and just have conversations with them about the challenges that I'm facing, as well as, you know, gain the perspective of the challenges that they're facing, and just support one another, become each other's anchors when things get rough, as well as they will help you find opportunity. And I think that's super important, especially navigating this as a person of color and an LGBTQ member, right? Having a network that is going to support you, uplift you. And I think that's super important. For self-care behaviors, again, I think self-care behaviors reflect back to acceptance. I think becoming conscious about how you treat yourself, how you're speaking to yourself is super important, right? Um, Something that I like to do, especially nowadays that everything's sort of chaotic in terms of politics. I usually like to do words of affirmation as they relate to belonging. So every morning I wake up and I journal, and I often write, I belong here. I I'm a good communicator. People want to hear my voice. People want to hear my story. And I think doing that really empowers you and really drives you to not doubt yourself, not doubt your identity, because, you know, it can become very challenging, and it's super important for you to prioritize yourself. You know, what does Tilden want? What does Angelica want? Um, and I think that is super important. And then the next one would be social activism. And to me, social activism manifests itself in different ways, right? For example, you can join an organization outside of work that does volunteer work. And I think always by giving, you always receive. And I think also, especially if you know, volunteer in places that reflect your identity, you get to have these conversations with people about their struggles, and you get to understand yourself a little bit more as well, right? Some things that you might have not, you know, thought about are brought into light, and you know, just driving that forward is super important, as well as understanding your history, right? Like, where do I come from? Where does my parents come from? Um, and I think finding role models is super important. Um, you know, when I was younger, to be honest, I did not have many LGBTQ role models. And I think having a role model can be a good pathway as to visualizing your future and, you know, manifesting certain characteristics that that you would like to portray. And the last one would be cognitive and behavioral flexibility. And I think this reflects back to all 4 points that I just made, and being able to bring all of those points together when different challenges arise, and being able to know how to maneuver the strategies that you're implementing. But without further ado, I think that's all I have. I will go ahead and pass it to Angelica so we can go to Q&A.
Q&A, Q&A.
Yes, I'm super excited. Let's see what everyone has to say.
So far in the chats.
Awesome. So if you have a question, please drop it in the chat. We'll use the last 15 minutes to address the Q&A.
Yeah, Angelica, we already had one that asked about Isaac Tilden, how do you navigate through age as a factor in intersectionality? Sometimes I struggle in trying to explain concepts like gender to my older colleagues. So, and then there was another one after that about, have you felt any division in the LGBT, by LGBTI, but I guess in the LGBT community when talking about white gays and Black gays and stuff like that. So we could get started with those two, or however we want to do it.
Yeah. Let's talk about the age factor, right? Different generations explaining LGBTQ. So we'll start off with you, Tilden, if you have any advice to give on that.
Yeah, so I think that's a really excellent question, especially because, you know, like this is how I feel about it. I think, you know, for a lot of folks in the older community, right, you know, they grew up at a time where, you know, gender and sexuality and gender expression wasn't really a conversation that was had in the mainstream. And, you know, it's important to realize that, that sort of framed their mindsets for, for quite some time. But at the same time, I think that when trying to connect with anybody, and this is especially me when I had my coming out experience and I had to, come out to my parents who sort of had, a little bit more traditional values and, sort of had a framed mindset in terms of gender and sexuality and, gender expression, was to, first of all, see where you connect on the issues, right? And, it's something as simple as a question like, hey, mom, dad, do you feel that anybody should have the opportunity to, to define how they want to live their lives, define what, do what makes them happy, and just start off, by having the conversation, at that point in time, see where you agree. And then, be willing to, just be patient when it comes to educating and just, talking and sharing with them about it. And also like one of the things that I've always done was, like, especially when coming out with my parents was, I would be like, like, mom, the Ellen you love so much on TV, Secrets, she's gay too. You know, or Don Lemon, oh, by the way, he's gay too. You know, and just, you know, make it, you know, you have to, you know, make them realize that it's not necessarily that, you know, and how do I put this? Like, everybody has blind spots and it's okay. You know, everybody has blind spots at different points in time, and that's okay. But we just need to be able to keep, you know, an open mind at all times, and, you know, be willing to learn on the issues. And for me, when I try to educate people or talk with people, it's always about finding the points of connection. And then from there, you know, going to our points of differences and seeing like, oh, okay, so this is why, you know, why I'm on the opposite side of this issue and why you're on the opposite side of this issue. But, you know, can we, you know, like, do you see where I'm coming from? And here's the truth, and I'm gonna be really honest, folks, like, you're not gonna change people's minds completely all the time. You know, even in the workplace, even at home, you know, with closest relatives, like, you're not gonna always be able to change people's minds. But what you wanna always aim to do is you wanna be able to, you know, have a conversation where it's, you know, you've shown where your similarities are, you point out, you know, this is where you guys differ, and then you afford the person grace, and I'm gonna underline that word, grace. Afford the person grace to take time, do reflections, and, you know, be willing to, you know, follow up on the conversation with you. And so that's sort of how I've always, you know, approached it too. And, you know, like, you know, that's sort of how I've always approached these conversations, aside, you know, just living and being my authentic self, both at home and at work. But Isaac, you might have some perspectives on this too as well.
Yes. So when dealing with age in terms of intersectionality, I mean, I think it's important to talk about your experience. You know, if you've had so much experience that you've lived through, and I think you can share that experience with other individuals. And I think, hold on, they're vacuuming. Okay, did you guys hear that? Sorry about that.
Don't worry about it.
But anyways, yeah, I definitely think this sort of boils down to, again, to just talking to each other, and you, like you said, to them, finding the point of connection, and just building from there. But I think that's all I have to add.
Yeah, and also, you know, when we talk about different intersections, you know, different generations, everybody has their strengths, right? I think when we think about generations within the workplace, everybody's, you know, at least interested, right, in at learning some area. So like Tilden said, finding a point of connection. But a tip that I could provide to the audience is, if this is something that you're experiencing in the workplace where you feel like maybe you're having some generational issues trying to explain LGBTQ advocacy, is make sure that the HR managers have training when it comes to pronouns, when it comes to benefits, right? Because, you know, being a part of diversity and inclusion, you know, I get HR managers all the time calling me, hey, how can I support a specific community, right? And they're like, when I was younger, you know, we didn't use these terms. This is all new to me, right? Adding the word Q, right? This is a new thing to the movement. So updating them on their knowledge, and I'm sure that they're always happy to learn more. And if you find like there's some hesitancy, sometimes it's about finding that connection. Most of the time, what I see in diversity is if I see somebody is really passionate about veterans, you know, that's kind of their main point into diversity and inclusion, providing support that way, and then eventually making them comfortable into talking about LGBTQ advocacy. Because a lot of the time what we see is just this huge resistance because people, A, are afraid to enter spaces where they think they can offend other people, or B, they have these implicit and unconscious biases, right? And then C, sometimes there's trauma, right? Issues, maybe within their own family. What is it there? So it's about showing people grace. It's really important to show people grace. And at the same time, still making sure that we're providing resources, right? Just because somebody might be older doesn't mean that they're not open to listening to advice. Maybe you just have to start the conversation. But also, you know, making sure that your HR managers are trained when it comes to gender pronouns, right? Talking about pronouns, benefits that are available for their employees. This is the best way that you can support the workforce. And I think there was a second question where Tilden, you mentioned around different conflicting issues. Go ahead.
Someone said, have you felt any division by LGBTI when talking about white gays and Black gays?
Anything to share on that?
Okay, so I'll be honest. I think, the division probably comes, at least for me in my experience, the division comes the most when we're deciding who to crown for RuPaul's Drag Race All Stars, or that's
Girl.
everybody comes with their factions. I'm Gigi Good. Folks are saying Crystal Method, Jada Essence Hall. Who, by the way, is Stan Shea Coulee. I think that's where you see, folks have different, lived experiences, and it all comes to foreplay. But, also kind of going off of that, right? This year, as well as, previous years, one of the most amazing things that I always see, and I really, I love the show so much for this, is that they all end up coming together, and folks talk it all out. They talk through the messy stuff that happens through the season, and are able to share on on being able to even with the differences, being able to appreciate one another. So I think I would say, like, in the gay community, like you know uh, we're definitely a wonderful mix. They're a wonderful mix of different people, different backgrounds that come together on the subject of race, on the subject of our different lived backgrounds, social economic status, and it all comes to foreplay, especially when it comes to issues, or like in this case, a show that we all love, and we all have strong opinions about. But it's always going to be messy from time to time, but it's ultimately about being able to end up coming together, calling out, what the issues were, and being able to, show appreciation and love for one another. And so, I think that's sort of my take on that. It happens. I've definitely seen, the divisions on different issues, but I think in the gay community, we've been able to talk about it, and I also think even in the Black community too, it's something that comes up, especially when we talk about all Black Lives Matter, right? It's like trying to highlight trans folks within our community who experience things at a much experience murder, and you know the statistics more than I do, at a much larger rate than we do. So it's something that we always just need to talk about it. But yeah, divisions exist, but I think what brings us together is so much more than what separates us.
Yeah, definitely. I do think divisions exist. I am Mexican, but I am white passing, even though sometimes not so much. But um, my skin color is white, so I mean, there is privilege there, and I think this division, um, at the end of the day, like as a white person, it is not your responsibility to, or yeah, it's not your responsibility to advocate in terms of this is what the Black people should feel. That it is the Black community's responsibility to define their struggles. And
Did he freeze?
Yeah,
I
froze.
think you might have froze, Isaac. And while we're waiting to reconnect him, there was a question here about being Latinx and not seeing representation in their LGBTQ group. So I'm trying to find the question here. Do you see what I'm talking about, Tilden? There's a lot of comments. We appreciate your comments. I'm going through them.
Comments. I'm trying to like scroll through. I think I see one on Oracle, but I don't see. Oh, I do. Okay. At work, I manage the Latinx EBG, but also realized there is no Latinx presence in the out EBG. So I want to make my voice heard. Any recommendations in how to balance out this work? I'll speak on it, girlfriend. Angelica, do you want to take that first, or I could, whoever?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just share, high level. I hear you. It's tough, right? Generationally, what we look at at the employee resource groups in corporate America, they're primarily white, right? And what we see when it comes to the national gay agenda, that's also an issue there. So that's what really removes people of color from wanting to join these spaces, because there's this national agenda, right? Like, this is the main thing we're going to focus on. And there's this erasure of not really understanding the issues that queer people of color also face, right? You also see a lack of leadership roles where queer people of color in their LGBTQ groups, you know, they're not involved in leadership opportunities, right? Ticket allocations is also an issue. We see this a lot with ERG groups across the nation, right, in corporate America. And I think, you know, the main thing is speak to that and say, look, I'm seeing that I'm not seeing a lot of representation in the group. And you have to look at two things. Is there just a lack of representation, right? So that's the first issue. That's more of a recruiting issue. But the second one is the messaging of the employee resource group not inclusive? And, you know, why are people not joining, right? If you see a person of color that's queer and they're not joining the group, asking those questions, because that'll really let you know. Why is this person not feeling like the ERG is a place for them? So lack of representation might be an issue, but if you are seeing that there is representation and the group's not a part, that highlights a bigger issue of maybe this person doesn't feel included, doesn't feel inclusive in the organization. And then speaking, you know, to the national leads and saying, this is an issue, you know, how can we resolve for that? Because half of the time, somebody just wants a phone call and say, we'd like you to sit at the table. And sometimes that's all it takes. But I'll pass it on to you, Tilden, and Isaac. I think
So we
might have dropped off. So we got about 2 more minutes.
Yeah, we've got about 2 minutes. So Angelica, I think you hit it on the head. I don't really have necessarily a lot more to add to that. But again, like, it's all about speaking your truth, being able to speak up, and you don't have to do it alone. Find, you know, your people, you know, get your coalition together and, you know, demand and ask for a seat at the table. That's really what I would say. There is a last question. We are at 2:28. I hope we can do this question justice. It says, has Oracle supported initiatives surrounding giving employees the ability to list their pronouns in your email signature lines? Well, I wouldn't say specifically with the emails. Maybe someone else could speak a little bit more to that. But we have with our internal directory, you know, our internal Facebook group. That's kind of like what I want to call that, as well as with some of our like internal messaging channels. So the answer to that is yes. Does anybody else want to add to that?
Yeah, for Slack, you know, there's an you can change your name on there. You know, you could put it on Zoom, email. So there's different opportunities there. It actually came from one of our employee resource group leaders to add, you know, pronouns on our internal kind of like search engine, or ARIA. So, you know, different opportunities there. But Isaac, I want to give you the last few seconds to see if you want to share anything before we close out.
I would definitely say that Oracle has been a great company to work for in terms of me being an LGBTQ member. There are so many resources at my disposal, and I really appreciate that. And Angelica, I also really appreciate you bringing this together and having this conversation, right? I think it's really impactful. And if you guys want to go ahead and also add me on LinkedIn, feel free to do so. I would love to connect with you all and have a conversation, you know, I would love to build an LGBTQ group. That'd be fabulous. But
also, don't forget to rate us in the survey. Survey possible. You know, give us 5 stars.
And
please rate us.
I would also say, Angelica, do we still have the resources for trans individuals in our company that you like to share?
Yeah, just very high level. You know, we have benefits within 100% covered within our organization. You know, just going to do a shameless plug. If anybody's looking for a job, Oracle's hiring. We've got a bunch of jobs right now. We're a great place to work. No shame in the game. But thank you, everybody, for joining us today. My name is Angelica Erazo. Thank you, Tilden and Isaac. And thank you, Marilu, for assisting us with the tech issues. Be blessed. Have a great day.
Thank you, y'all. Take care.